we'll use our farm as an example. Hog Island Oysters was started almost 35 years ago. A couple of folks, young men, aspirational, out of college like you all, thinking we want to do something with aquaculture and producing quality food. They're very idealistic, and there has always been some oyster farming for at least 100 years, we think, in this bay. But in the 1980s, when they were kind of getting back into it, they saw this bay, they felt like there was some potential there. And I think, as the story goes, there were some surfboards on the roof and stuff like that. I think living close by was a good gig. And they started growing some oysters. Now, oysters are a little bit tricky for a couple of reasons, and this is important from a culinary perspective. So it sounds sciencey, but it's something that as a chef will help you understand. For example, when you're selecting shellfish, some of the seasonality issues. So in the wild, I know y'all are looking at me, you're also looking at the beautiful scenery, but I need to talk to you about something that's a little bit awkward. Oyster sex.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, you're in. Okay, we're okay. Are we okay with that? We're not gonna get too graphic, but all food, all animals, all plants, the reproduction is part of it. Success means to survive and thrive in this generation and send your genes forward into the next generation. If you're living great, but your genes don't travel to the next generation, and we can't say that you're successful over the long evolutionary arc of time, right? So oysters, so humans and grizzly bears, large mammals, they have a strategy of investing a lot of resources into raising very few young. But the survival rate is quite high, right? And the parents, their college education and the first cars, and man, at that rate you can only raise 2 or 3 kids, right? Or 2 or 3 grizzly bears in your whole life because it's so expensive. But the success rate is very high. On the other end of the reproduction spectrum are oysters, who say, I'm stuck, I'm stuck on this rock and all I can do is this, right? I can't even get close to my boyfriend or girlfriend. I can't even scooch over on Fridays. I just have to hang out separated like this and filter water, right? So I don't think I'm gonna be able to invest a lot of resources in caring for my young since I can't even move around. So oysters have developed a strategy that we call broadcast spawning. And once a year, an oyster, a female oyster, just pick up a shell here, like this size, this could be an adult. These could be adults. At about a year, they feel the water temperature getting warmer. Okay, no heavy breathing in the audience, right? The water temperature is getting warmer and the food is starting to flow in with the spring tides. And that's something, they don't have brains, so we can't really, attribute it. They get that cue. It's time to start preparing for reproduction, right? And so the females will begin developing tremendous amounts of eggs, right? Any guesses at how many eggs an oyster that size might release each year into the water? 1,000, million, 10 million. How about, let's just bracket it. Yeah, millions, 10 million per little oyster. You're thinking, whoo, that's a lot of oysters on the half shell, let's go into the oyster business. And the males, and as the water warms up and the food comes in, they all know within a couple of days, within a few days, this is in the wild, right? Not in the farm. It's time to have the annual oyster rave, right? Or whatever they're gonna call it. And what happens at the annual oyster hookup? Nothing, right? They just are filter feeding and all the eggs come out and all the male reproductive material comes out and it just mixes up in the ocean, right? And the eggs are fertilized in the ocean and they become part of the plankton. We call it the planktonic soup. Now we have a problem. 10 million eggs per individual, millions of oysters in the ocean, gazillions and gazillions of fertilized eggs are now bobbing around. What do you think the survival rate is in the wild?
0.00000.
You're getting in there, yeah. About 0.1%. 99.9% of all those little fertilized eggs are not, I'm sorry to say, going to make it to the next generation, because the little microzooplankton are gobbling them up. They're saying, woo, backstroke in the hard-boiled egg soup, and they eat them all, right? And so oyster reproduction is very tricky. If we want to farm oysters, it's really hard to build a business around a 99.9% death rate, yeah? Now for the oyster, it works out, because anybody good with math, what is 0.1% of 10 million?
100,000.
1,000, thank you, very well. And so that means that for the oyster, 1,000 to 1, 1,000 to 2 ratio for reproduction a year, that's really good for them. It's working for them. But as a business model, it's really horrible, right? Well, let's see, 99.9% of our oysters, we're gonna die, right? So the farmer has had to co-opt that process, right? And we wanna come back to that spawning thing, because if you really love oysters and you've tasted them, there's a time of year when an oyster tastes incredibly firm and tastes of the sea, and there's a time of the year when the oyster tastes like eggs. And there's a reason for that, right? Because they're full of sperm and eggs. And when you're eating an oyster during the peak of reproductive season, you're really tasting a lot of, we'll call it gamete, reproductive material. And it just is a very different flavor that's a good time to grill the oysters, right? Some barbecue sauce, some bourbon, right? So the oyster farmer is faced with a bit of a challenge there. How do we get the oysters to reproduce in a more predictable and successful way, right? And the answer for most oyster farmers today is what we call a hatchery, right? Or it's basically an aquarium environment. So now we take our perfect oyster. George said we have a perfect oyster we're striving for. We choose some of those that are like the broodstock, parents. We put them in the aquarium. We get the temperature going just right. We have the algae. We put the algae in for them. We put on the, who's your favorite pop musician?
Marvin Gaye.
Huh?
What?
Who?
Marvin Gaye, sure.
Marvin Gaye. We put the Marvin Gaye music on, and the oysters just get very relaxed. And so we can induce them to spawn in the aquarium. But guess what? What's not in the aquarium? Predators, that's right. And so we go from a 0.1% survival rate to 40 or 50%. And out of 10 million, we're nodding, because that's millions of successfully hatched babies, eggs. We can raise them until they are, ready to be safely put out into the wild, into a farmed environment. So the hatchery has become a critical piece in the way that oyster farmers approach success. Because we can control the thermal conditions, we can actually create spawning every month, and we can keep a steady monthly production cycle of new baby oysters that we can then plant out, so that we harvest, because our customers don't want to just eat oysters a couple of weeks out of the year, and we don't want to just sell them a couple of weeks out of the year. We're harvesting oysters almost every day, right? And so we have to be planting oysters almost every day if we want to continue that trend. We're harvesting many hundreds of thousands a week now, a lot of oysters. So the hatchery has been really, really important for us and for other oyster farms. Our hatchery is north of here in Humboldt Bay for some various reasons. So the hatchery does another critical thing. You remember what I said? Where does an oyster want to stick itself? Fasten itself? Pillars, pilings, and especially other shells. So let's think about it. The little baby oysters are out there bobbing around in the water, the ones that don't get eaten. And at about 2 or 3 weeks, they grow a little foot. And they get this cue that it's time to stick that foot somewhere stable, where there's going to be good food and they're going to be protected. Where would you stick your foot if you wanted to have good food for the rest of your life? I like to tell people, the grandparents' house, right? So oysters really want to put that foot on the shells of big oysters, right? Because hey, it's working for them, it's working for those big oysters, so why not live where they're living and see if we can grow there too. So in nature, many oysters tend to form reefs, like coral reefs, except they're made of oysters. And that's really cool, but when you're gonna shuck them and eat them on the half shell, it's hard to shuck a reef, you know? And in the old days, they would harvest chunks off these reefs and, you know, open the different oysters, break them apart. And usually you would be eating oysters that were pre-shucked out of a jar or a can. But in the half shell trade, we want, as George said, a beautiful half shell oyster with a deep cup and a flat top and a strong shell. So in the hatchery, we do one more little trick before we move them out here. We grind up shell into a fine sand, and the grains of sand are just big enough for 1 foot to come down and stick to it. After that, there's no more room on the grain, so the oyster's done what they want to do. They've stuck their foot on a calcium carbonate structure, and we have individual oysters, right? Now the deal is, once you've tricked them into not sticking their foot someplace secure, they will get washed away, right? So we grow them in the hatchery until they're, you know, about the size of my thumb, like that. And then we load them into bags. We bring them here, and this is stapled shut. We can put a couple of hundred oysters in each of these bags. This is a French technique. The French, as you probably know, are crazy about oysters. There's a lot of conversation that we have on it. So they developed this technique. It works really well. You put the young oysters in these bags, you put them together on these racks, and you place them in good locations in a bay. And the tides come in, the food comes, the oysters in the bags can filter feed, the bags keep the predators out, like the little starfish and things that want to come eat them. And basically at that point, the wild bay environment takes over. We check on them occasionally. We might flip these racks, but generally they're going to grow out here. So technically we're what's called a grow out farm, right? We're not raising them from eggs. We're doing that in hatchery environments, and then we're essentially like a farmer planting them into the bay, and then the bay is feeding them. And then fast forward for a nice small half shell oyster like this, they're only out there for about a year because the food here is very abundant. The guys go out in the boats. They're out there now working the lease. It's around the corner. They pull these racks onto the boat, and the oyster has been officially harvested, right? That's it. No cutting, no clipping. And these bags come in, and they get processed up on this back deck. And that's the part that George is going to tell you about, which is super cool. And so I don't